Jeremy Bentham was the founder of utilitarianism. And I think before you understand Bentham, you kind of have to understand where he comes from. Bentham was born and lived in England around the same time that Karl Marx lived in England. And the society at the time was very much a divided time. It's also a similar time to when Charles Dickens is doing his writing. And when you get stories like The Christmas Carol, a lot of us see the Christmas Carol as this, kind of hopeful story about Scrooge, this kind of unusual guy who doesn't give and help the poor. But to a large degree, Scrooge is sort of emblematic of that period in which you have this wealthy class that has absolutely zero regard for the working class. They consider the working class to be subhuman, that they're just people there to do their bidding and do their job and make the money. Now, Scrooge is a particularly negative version because he doesn't even enjoy life himself, perhaps. But he is definitely nothing more than what we might consider just a typical person during that period. And Dickens also writes a story called The Tale of Two Cities. And A Tale of Two Cities is all about, it's the best of times, it was the worst of times. And, it's the idea that there's a society in which there's people with great wealth, and there's a part of the society that is very poor and very difficult. And so you can live in the same city, and yet you can be extremely wealthy or you can be extremely rich, and you would have a completely different feeling about what the city is. And so the idea there is, that. And that story of Dickens, I think it's that one that he has where a guy actually hits a child with his carriage as he's speeding through town. He's driving recklessly and he runs over and he kills this kid. And he gets out of his car, his coach, and he says to the guy, "Oh man, you know what? I didn't mean to hit the kid and kill him. What do I owe you for him?" And he offers him and he throws him a bag of money and says, "Here, I got to get going. I got meetings to be to, but here, this should compensate for his death." The idea here is that this person is dead, but yet the person doesn't even have the regard to think of the child as a human. It's like hitting a dog or something, like I'm going to pay you for your loss to bury him, to get a new dog, maybe a little bit for pain and suffering, but then after that, you really have no other recourse against me. And that's sort of the way that it was viewed. There was the wealthy and there was the poor. And Bentham was born into this period of time. And what Bentham was attempting to do was to come up with a theory that would, he was trying to come up with a theory that would speak to that divide. He was trying to come up with a theory that would try to bring people to be more understanding of people who are not of their class, and try to get them to think of them as moral agents, as people who are worth considering in a moral analysis. And the way he does is to say, if you can feel pain or you can feel pleasure, then you matter, and you should be considered whenever an action is taken. If you're going to do anything, you need to look at anybody who can feel pleasure, anybody who can feel pain, and take their pleasure and pain into account. Not just your own, not just your buddies or your cronies, but you need to take everybody into account. And so Bentham comes up with this theory. I mentioned Marx. Marx also was from this period. Marx is talking about labor, trying to overthrow, he gives a whole history. What's interesting is about this is that, the whole concept of socialism and people overthrowing or kind of setting up a communistic state is part of this same dealing with this social divide. What's interesting, in my opinion, about Marx is Marx was a sociologist who was interested in describing the way he thought society was going to unfold. How a history of how feudalism gave way to industrialization, and as a result, there was sort of these feudal concepts that spilled over into a new urban industrialized world, and that eventually the people would react, and they would eventually demand the government, or demand a bloody revolution, and that they would then set up a more socialistic or communistic society. In the end, Marx didn't really describe history as much as he also helped spur on history. Bentham, on the other hand, came in. He was interested in actually spurring on change, and he ended up kind of describing or a theory. So Marx was trying to do theory and ended up creating social change. Bentham was trying to create social change and ended up with a theory. And so it's sort of an interesting dichotomy, but it's all at that same time, all about the same type of issue. Now, as far as Bentham goes, Bentham was hoping to bring about social change. Bentham was very influential in society. He was very much a person of well regard. He was politically active. People had a great deal of respect for him, and so Bentham was one who was hoping that he could bring about social change and try to make people more cognizant of other people and society. Now, with that said, what happened is is Bentham. One of the more interesting things about him, as sort of an example of the social change he hoped to bring, was Bentham actually had this idea that we Bentham actually had this idea about social change. He actually had this idea that when he died, he would donate his body to science, and he would donate it to science so that they would be able to use it for research. Now, this is a perfect utilitarian example because basically he's saying my body is of no use to me, but it can bring pleasure to other people. So the best thing to do with my body is to allow it to be studied. But the other thing is there was a great demand. Medical research was just beginning to develop. There were no real cadavers. People didn't understand how the human body worked. And so there was a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding of the human body. And so Bentham, by donating his body, was allowing for medical research to go on, but he was also helping to demystify death. At the time, nobody would want their bodies to be buried. They would want them, buried immediately. There was a fear of death. But the reality is that death is not nearly as scary. Bodies are just bodies. I mean, there's nothing particularly negative about bodies, unless they have Ebola and they're excreting out bodily fluids and you're touching them. A body really is of not much danger to you. If you're in a room with somebody with pneumonia, you're more likely to get pneumonia from somebody who's barely sick with pneumonia than somebody who has just died from pneumonia. Why? Because the person who just died from pneumonia is no longer breathing. They're no longer aspirating out the germs. Somebody who's breathing, if they have a really mild form of pneumonia, which I don't know if there's a mild form, but if they have something very simple, they're breathing it and they're expelling the disease out into the air. And so, you kind of have to figure that that somebody with that there is not nearly as scary, this whole death thing, as people might want you to think. Now, with that said, what he did was he gave his body so that it would kind of demystify the concept of death, but also with the hope being that not only would it demystify death, but it might also encourage other people to donate their bodies and have a more positive view. And so it was all very utilitarian. Now, the thing that makes this a lot of fun is after they did this research, which I don't know if they even did that much research, they actually had his body preserved and sort of like a taxidermy service. They actually had it kind of put together and stitched together and, put on like a mannequin. And, basically they did a whole, they basically preserved his body. Lenin, or was it Stalin? I think it was Stalin. They preserved his body. No, I'm sorry, it was Lenin. Evita, the South American leader, Eva Peron, her body was preserved for a while and on display. And the same thing was done with Bentham. What they did is they kind of did this taxidermy service, and they preserved it, and they actually put it in a chair, and they put it in the main hallway at the college he started, University College, and it sits there. And actually, it's still there to this day, that it's still there in the front corridor. And apparently, it's there in this case. They can open it, and people walking by can see it, and it helps demystify death. But it also is the case they can open the case, and they can actually roll it out and roll it down the hallway to where they hold their board meetings. And they can actually, and then what happens is whenever they have a board meeting, they actually wheel Bentham out, down the hall and put him there. And the story is, and I don't know how true this is, but I'm guessing it is. It sounds like a good story either way. But what they would do is they'll say Bentham present, not voting, whenever they call the roll. And so Bentham still attends these meetings, and that was kind of the idea. So if you want to, I can get this to pop up here. Now it's not going to do it. You can see my child's artwork back there. Anyway, if you look here on my computer screen, let me see if I can get it on there right. If you see there, that is a guy standing next to the case where Bentham's body is at. And if you look there, if you look, you can see the two doors open, and there's kind of a little thing with a couple of little wheels. If you look at the very bottom real close, you can see the wheels. And that's where his body is currently at. Now, what's interesting is you see that there, and we can actually pull up another one here. You see his face and everything that's actually there. That actually is a wax cutout, or actually a wax head. His old head deteriorated a considerable amount, and they actually had to get rid of it. But if you look here, this is sort of an interesting picture, because down here between his legs, and you can type in Jeremy Bentham body and do an image search in Google, that's actually his head. His head actually began to decay to a point that they considered it grotesque, and so they replaced it with a wax head, and that's a rare picture with it between his legs. In fact, what they ended up doing was they put it in his chest, and so when you see these other images like this of the body, or this one, what you're actually seeing is the body with the head in the chest. And if you want to see the head up close, not sure if you can see it, but that's his head there. You can see a few pictures of it. Anyway, not the best way to do that. I perhaps will need to do a cutout of those, or print those out. But that's basically a little story about Jeremy Bentham. Kind of an interesting character, to say the least.